Hi, my name is Jill Matsko. I'm professor at UNC, and today I'm going to give my micro teaching on the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I felt a little bit strange without the slides, and so that's why I have included PowerPoint slides here, and hopefully this screen sharing will work out properly. So, what led up to the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Obviously, World War II. But the one specific thing that I'd like to mention is the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was catalyzed by the Einstein-Szilard letter to FDR, to President Roosevelt in 1939. There are multiple scientists who are very concerned about the Nazis being able to produce a nuclear bomb and the danger that that might pose for us. And so they asked FDR to fund research efforts so that the US could beat the Nazis to a nuclear bomb. And indeed, he agreed, especially because it had Einstein's name on it, Einstein's signature. And so the national government funded this completely secret project, the Manhattan Project. In 2016 dollars, it ended up costing $22 billion. At one point, it was 0.4% of the US's GDP. So this is a good amount of money that they spent. And so they had many scientists working on it, just many employees working on gathering the materials for this nuclear bomb, doing all this research. And it culminated in the Trinity test, the first ever nuclear bomb. And it was on July 16th, 1945. Oppenheimer, who actually the scientist in charge of the project, when he saw this nuclear bomb explode, he said afterwards that the words that came to mind are, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of words," which comes from the Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita. And so here is a picture. Of course, they had many videos going on, picture of the Trinity test, and it's just huge. It was overwhelming, as many of them called it. Right, so what were the actual events that were coming up here that's led up to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, so of course there was World War II. The U.S. was part of it, part of the Allies. And then I want to focus on the very end of World War II. So Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. So that Western Front was done. And so instead the Allies focused on the Eastern Front, especially on the Japanese, specifically the Japanese. And on July 26, 1945, they demanded the unconditional surrender of the Japanese, but the Japanese refused. They just ignored that request. So August 6th and 9th, the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, two cities in Japan. There were major manufacturing centers. They were not army centers, although there were army bases there, but there were manufacturing centers. These two bombs killed an estimated 130,000 to 226,000 people of the Japanese, right? And immediately after that, 6 days later, the Japanese surrendered. The emperor surrendered unconditionally. So it got its goal, right? They wanted the war to be over, and the war was over. But was it worth it? Right. First, some reasons for why the nuclear bomb was used. First, it went to save American lives because they were weighing the alternatives. The alternative was to actually invade the Japanese mainland. Contemporary estimates suggest that this invasion would have cost 200,000 American lives. And then there were about 200,000 Japanese that were actually killed by this bomb. So yes, it did reduce the American deaths, but there are approximately, contemporary estimates say that's approximately equal deaths that happened. A second reason was more emotional and political, just to shorten the war and redeployment. We had soldiers coming back from the Western Front, and they didn't want to send them to the Eastern Front, and so they just wanted the war to finish. Third is an argument many people, especially those who were working on the Manhattan Project, really supported, to announce the atomic epic fittingly. After achieving success in creating the first nuclear bomb, this totally new weapon of war, I mean, how else to share the news, as some people would say, right? You just want to send out pictures from the Trinity test, or would you like to end a war with it? And so some people argued that this was a reason for why the nuclear bomb should be used in war. Fourth was to minimize the expansion of Russian power in the Far East. The Russians had been focusing on the German front, but with the Germans just out of the way, the Russians were actually traveling to Japan. They had their soldiers marching across Russia in order to invade Japan. But if the United States could finish the war before the Russians got to Japan, then the Russians wouldn't be able to have this influence in Japan. They would be just kept out of the whole Japanese, the Far East. So other arguments for why not to use the nuclear bomb, why they shouldn't have. In the short term, a short-term consequence is that it infuriated Russia. Russia was very angry that they didn't get part in the Japanese war, which sounds kind of strange. But because they didn't fight in the Japanese war or the Japanese front, they didn't get as much results of the spoils of war, right? So Russia was very angry, which ended up leading partially to the Cold War. In the long term, it sacrificed public support for the U.S. That we would do something so brutal as blowing up two cities, hundreds of thousands of people. It started the nuclear war, right? This nuclear race. In order, we were the first people to have a nuclear bomb, but of course, many people followed. Now, I think the latest is like there are 12 countries that have nuclear bombs accessible to them. And third, of course, if people are going to have these nuclear bombs, you want to have some kind of international agreement. And the Americans are going to be the only ones who have used the nuclear bomb in war. And so it's going to bring some prejudice to working out that international agreement. So that was really quickly the arguments for and against. Obviously, FDR chose for, and so they bombed Japan, and they ended the war. So usually if I had more time in class, I would have an open discussion with the students. Are these reasons, arguments legitimate? What do you think is more important? And then try to come to this conclusion: should the nuclear bombs have been used in Japan or not? This is an ongoing controversy and debate. And then I have the students write an essay, an assignment, where they take the perspective of someone who lived through the bombings, either someone who was actually in the bombings, like a Japanese survivor, or someone else in Japan, like the emperor, a soldier, or someone else on the Allies, a soldier, a citizen, or actually someone who worked on the Manhattan Project. I think is both interesting, like Oppenheimer himself. Right, so write an op-ed from that perspective on whether the bombing was the right choice, and give arguments why. And then the arguments on the other side as well, so of course respond to those arguments. And so I've given this assignment in class, and the students really love taking on this perspective of someone else, stepping into someone else's shoes and thinking about what they would argue and what they think is most. There we go. We have the nuclear bomb, bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just a big overview of the arguments for and against and the controversy around it.